Welcome, dear listener, to Death in the Glassmaker's Garden, a Miss Marple mystery. I'm delighted you've joined us for this cozy tale of intrigue set in the charming English village of St. Mary Mead. Pour yourself a nice cup of tea, settle into your favorite armchair, and let us transport you back to the 1950s, where Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming elderly spinster with a mind as sharp as a knitting needle, unravels a puzzling death amid blooming flowers and shimmering glass. This audiobook is divided into 10 chapters for your convenience, each lasting about 8 to 10 minutes when narrated at a leisurely pace. Now, let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. The Shattered Bloom. In the quaint English village of St. Mary Mead, nestled amid the rolling hills of the countryside like a pearl in a velvet box, life unfolded with the predictable grace of a well-tended garden. It was the spring of 1952, a time when the war's shadows had begun to recede, leaving behind a nation eager to reclaim its gentle rhythms. The village, with its cluster of thatched cottages, stone-walled lanes, and the occasional motor car chugging past the ancient church, embodied the very essence of rural England. Hedgerows burst forth with hawthorn blossoms, their white petals drifting like snowflakes on the breeze, and the air carried the mingled scents of fresh-baked bread from the bakery and damp earth from the nearby meadows. At the heart of this serene tableau sat Miss Jane Marple, in her modest cottage on the edge of the high street. She was an elderly lady of indeterminate age, though villagers whispered she must be nearing 80. With fluffy white hair pinned neatly beneath a lace cap, and eyes of a piercing blue that belied her mild demeanor. Dressed in a simple woolen skirt and cardigan, she occupied her favorite armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a scarf of soft lavender yarn. The sitting room was a haven of comfort. Polished misplaced umbrella or a spat over the flower show prizes. Yet Miss Marple knew from experience that beneath the surface tranquility lurked the same passions that stirred in grander places: jealousy, greed, love unrequited. She had seen it all in her long life, drawing parallels from the village follies to the greater crimes she had quietly helped unravel. A sharp rap at the door startled her from her reverie. Setting down her needles with a soft sigh, she rose and smoothed her skirt before opening the door. There stood Dolly Bantry, her dear friend from Gossington Hall, the manor house on the outskirts of the village. Mrs. Bantry was a plump, affable woman in her 60s, with a fondness for floral dresses and an even greater fondness for gossip. Today, however, her round face was flushed, her hat askew, and her eyes wide with uncharacteristic alarm. She clutched a handkerchief in one gloved hand, dabbing at her forehead despite the mild weather. "Jane! Oh, Jane, you must come at once," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, breathlessly stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She collapsed into the armchair opposite Miss Marple's, fanning herself with the handkerchief. "It's dreadful, absolutely dreadful. I've just come from the high street and the news is all over the village. Mr. Elias Thorne, the glassmaker, has been found dead in his garden." Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened, though her expression remained serene. She poured a cup of tea for her friend from the pot on the side table, handing it over with a steady hand. "Dead, you say, Dolly? How very unfortunate. Sit down properly and tell me everything from the beginning. A shock like that calls for a spot of tea to steady the nerves. Mrs. Bantry took the cup gratefully, sipping before launching into her tale. Well, it was young Tommy Briggs, the baker's boy, who discovered him. He delivers bread to Glassbloom House every morning, you know, and today when he arrived, the gate was ajar, and there was Mr. Thorne slumped beside one of his glass rose bushes, all shattered to pieces. The poor lad ran straight to the police station, blended the art of horticulture with his glass-blowing skills. The garden was a wonder. Real flowers intertwined with ethereal glass sculptures. Roses that gleamed like jewels. Birds frozen mid-flight. Even a fountain where water trickled over crystalline leaves. Villagers admired it from afar, though Thorne guarded his privacy fiercely, rarely inviting visitors beyond his immediate circle. Arguments, you say? Miss Marple prompted gently, resuming her seat and picking up her knitting once more. The needles clicked softly, a soothing counterpoint to Mrs. Bantry's agitation. Oh yes, with his nephew, Victor, for one. That young man is always in some scrape or another. Gambling debts in the city, they say. He was visiting last week, and I heard raised voices from the garden. Something about the will and inheritance. Thorne had no children, you see, and Victor's the only family left. Then there's his business partner, Mr. Grimshaw, always quarreling over profits. And don't get me started on the housekeeper, Lydia Hawthorne. She's been with him for years, but lately, she's seemed jumpy as a cat on hot bricks. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And the gardener? Harold Digby, isn't it? He tends the grounds, I believe. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened further. Exactly. Thorne fired him just yesterday over some broken pot or other. Digby's a surly sort, and who knows what grudges he harbors. Oh, Jane, it's just like one of those murders in your detective stories. You must come and see for yourself. The whole village is buzzing, and Constable Polk is out of his depth as usual. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with a small smile. Very well, Dolly. A walk will do me good. And curiosity is a powerful motivator at my age. She donned her sensible hat and coat, grabbing a walking stick more for appearance than need. Her steps were as spry as her mind. Together the ladies. Morning, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry. Sad business, this. Nothing suspicious, mind. Heart gave out, that's all. But you're welcome to look, if it eases your minds. Miss Marple thanked him politely and stepped through the gate, her eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a hawk. Elias Thorne lay where he had fallen, his body now covered respectfully with a sheet by the doctor's assistant. He had been a slight man, with wiry gray hair and spectacles that now lay askew on the ground nearby. His face, what little she could glimpse before the sheet was adjusted, bore an expression of mild surprise, as if death had caught him unawares mid-thought. The shattered glass rose bush was the focal point, a magnificent creation of red-tinted glass petals and thorny stems, now reduced to glittering shards scattered across the path like fallen stars. Thorne must have collapsed against it, or so the assumption went. But Miss Marple's keen gaze noted discrepancies. The breakage was uneven, not the random pattern of a mere fall. but as if something had been smashed, deliberately, with force. Soil was disturbed around the base, and a few real rose petals from adjacent bushes were trampled underfoot. Mrs. Bantry hovered nearby, whispering, "See? Just as I said. Poor man." Dr. Haydock approached, a kindly gentleman in tweeds. "Ah, Miss Marple. Natural causes, I'm afraid. No signs of violence, though I'll confirm at the post-mortem. He was in fine health last I checked, but these things happen." Miss Marple murmured her agreement, but her attention was drawn elsewhere. A few paces away, lying incongruously on the manicured lawn, was a single glass petal, unbroken, pristine, its edges curving gracefully as if plucked fresh from the bush. It had no business being there, so far from the wreckage. Bending down with a slight creak of joints, she examined it closely. The petal was cool to the touch, etched with a faint vein pattern that mimicked nature perfectly. But something else caught her eye. A tiny speck of golden haze that softened the edges of its thatched roofs and stone walls. The news of Elias Thorne's untimely death in his garden at Glassbloom House had spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community, igniting whispers that buzzed from the bakery to the post office. By noon the air was thick with speculation, and the villagers, ever eager for a story, gathered in small knots to dissect the tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender scarf draped loosely over her shoulders, made her way along the high street toward the Blue Boar Tea Shop, a quaint establishment where the scent of fresh scones and brewing tea promised both comfort and conversation. She knew that in a village like St. Mary Mead, the truth often hid in the mundane chatter of everyday life, like a needle tucked into a skein of wool. The tea shop was a cozy haven, its windows adorned with chintz curtains and its tables set with mismatched china that gave it a homely charm. A bell tinkled as Miss Marple pushed open the door, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the polished wooden floor. Inside, the hum of voices dipped momentarily as heads turned to acknowledge her arrival. Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed arbiter of gossip, sat at a corner table, her hat a confection of feathers that bobbed as she leaned toward her companion, Miss Weatherby, a timid spinster with a penchant for knitting patterns. At another table, young Tommy Briggs, the baker's boy who had discovered Thorne's body, recounted his tale to a rapt audience of shopgirls, his cheeks flushed with the importance of the moment. Miss Marple settled at a small table by the window, her sharp blue eyes taking in the scene as she ordered a pot of Earl Grey and a scone from the rosy-cheeked waitress, Betty. The girl, barely out of her teens, hovered a moment longer than necessary, eager to share the latest tidbit. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it awful about Mr. Thorne? They're saying it was his heart, but my cousin saw him only last week, hale and hearty, working away in that garden of his, and now dead as a doornail beside that glass rose bush." Betty shivered dramatically, her apron strings, librarian shelving books. Victor Thorne, Elias's nephew, was a familiar figure in St. Mary Mead, though his visits were sporadic. A handsome young man in his early 30s with slicked-back hair and a charming smile that masked a restless nature, he had a reputation for fast living and faster debts. Miss Marple recalled seeing him at the summer fete last year, tossing coins at the tombola with a reckless air, his laughter a touch too loud. An argument over the will, she mused, was precisely the sort of thing that could stir trouble in a village, or worse. As Betty bustled off to fetch the tea, Mrs. Price Ridley caught Miss Marple's eye and waved her over with a flourish of her feathered hat. "Miss Marple, do join us. You'll want to hear this, I'm sure. Such a tragedy about poor Mr. Thorne, and I'm not convinced it's as simple as Dr. Haydock claims." Her voice carried the weight of authority, though Miss Marple knew her pronouncements were often more theatrical than accurate. Settling at their table with her tea and scone, Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Weatherby. I've just come from Glassbloom House, and it's certainly a sad affair. What have you heard?" Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes gleamed with the thrill of imparting news. "Well, my dear, I was passing by the garden yesterday, on my way to the Women's Institute, you understand, and I distinctly heard raised voices. It was Mr. Thorne and that nephew of his, Victor. I couldn't catch every word, but there was talk of cutting you out and no more handouts. Mark my words, that young man's in debt up to his ears, and with Mr. Thorne gone, he'll be expecting a windfall. Greedy, that's what he is." Miss Weatherby, clutching her knitting, nodded timidly. "It's true, Miss Marple. Victor was at the shop last month, trying to buy on credit. Mr. Thorne had to settle the bill himself. Oh, it's dreadful to think of family turning against family." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving connections. "Served the Thorne household faithfully since Elias's wife passed a decade ago, tending the cottage with a devotion that bordered on proprietary. But borrowing money, that was new and potentially significant." "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured. "That does sound unlike Lydia. Did she say anything about Mr. Thorne's state of mind?" Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward, her feathers quivering. "She told Mrs. Clement at the vicarage that Mr. Thorne was agitated these past weeks. Kept muttering about someone stealing his designs. Those glass flowers of his, you know, the ones that fetch such prices in London. He was convinced someone was copying his techniques, though he wouldn't say who." This piqued Miss Marple's interest. Elias Thorne's glass creations were not just art. They were the product of a unique process he guarded jealously. If someone had been pilfering his methods, it could explain his agitation, and perhaps provide a motive for something darker. She made a mental note to speak with Lydia herself. As the tea-shop conversation swirled, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the door as Arthur Grimshaw, Thorne's business partner, entered. A stern man of 50 with a bristling mustache and a suit that spoke of city ambitions, Grimshaw was an outsider in St. Mary Mead, having moved from Bristol to manage the commercial side of Thorne's glassworks. He nodded curtly to the room before taking a table alone, his expression grim as he ordered a black coffee, a rarity in a village devoted to tea. Miss Marple excused herself from Mrs. Price Ridley's table and approached him, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. "Mr. Grimshaw, what a sad day for us all. I understand you worked closely with Mr. Thorne. My condolences." Grimshaw's mustache twitched and he gave a short nod. "Thank you, Miss Marple. A tragic loss indeed. Elias was a genius with glass. Irreplaceable. We were on the cusp of expanding the business, you know. He'd perfected a new technique for iridescent blooms, like nothing anyone's seen. Could have made us a fortune." Briggs's table. "I saw someone near the garden last night," he was saying, his voice low but eager. "A shadow, moving quick by the gate. Couldn't see who, but it gave me the creeps." The shopgirls gasped, but Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. A shadowy figure was just the sort of red herring that could cloud a case, likely the postman on his late rounds, as he often took the shortcut past Glassbloom House. Still, she tucked the tidbit away, knowing even false leads could illuminate the truth by contrast. Leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Lydia Hawthorne. The housekeeper lived in a small room at Glassbloom House, and if anyone knew Thorne's recent habits, it would be her. The walk back to the cottage was pleasant, the lanes lined with cowslips and the distant bleat of sheep drifting from the meadows. As she approached, she saw Lydia in the garden, kneeling by a bed of marigolds, her hands busy with the trowel but her face pale and strained. "Good afternoon, Lydia," Miss Marple called softly, pausing at the gate. "May I have a word?" Lydia started, dropping her trowel with a clatter. "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me a turn. Yes, of course, come in." She stood, brushing dirt from her apron, her fingers trembling slightly. They sat on a wrought-iron bench amid the glass sculptures, their surfaces catching the light like frozen rainbows. Lydia's eyes were red-rimmed, and she twisted her apron as she spoke. "It's awful, miss. Mr. Thorne was so kind, always giving me little glass trinkets for my mantelpiece. A bird, a flower. He said I brightened his days. But lately he was worried sick. Kept saying someone was after his secrets, sneaking about the workshop. He even locked his designs in a safe, which wasn't like him." Miss Marple listened, her expression one of gentle concern. "That must have been distressing for you, Lydia. Did he mention anyone in particular? A name, perhaps?" Lydia shook her head. "No, miss, but he was short with everyone, even Mr. Grimshaw, and they were thick as thieves usually. And Victor, well, they had words yesterday." Villagers exchanging theories over garden fences and in the shade of the ancient yew tree by the church. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the light and a shawl draped over her shoulders, accepted an invitation to tea at Glassbloom House. It was a chance to meet the key figures in Thorne's life and observe the subtle currents of human nature that often revealed more than words. She walked briskly along the lane, her walking stick tapping a steady rhythm, though her sharp eyes missed nothing: the flutter of a curtain in a cottage window, the hurried glance of a passerby, the faint scent of honeysuckle mingling with the earthier notes of turned soil. Glassbloom House stood at the village's edge, its stone facade softened by climbing roses and ivy. The garden, Thorne's pride and legacy, was a spectacle even in morning. Real blooms, dahlias, peonies, and foxgloves, intertwined with his glass creations. Crystalline lilies that shimmered like dew, delicate glass sparrows perched on real twigs, and a trellis where glass vines curled alongside living ones. The shattered rose bush, cordoned off by Constable Polk's orders, was a stark reminder of the morning's tragedy, its red-tinted shards glinting like spilled blood in the sunlight. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her gaze lingering on the scene. The single, unbroken glass petal she had noticed earlier, lying so oddly apart, nagged at her memory. It was a detail that refused to fit neatly into the narrative of a simple heart attack. Lydia Hawthorne, the housekeeper, greeted her at the door, her plump face pale and her hands fidgeting with her apron strings. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank you for coming," she said, her voice tremulous. "It's all so dreadful. Please, come in. The others are in the drawing room." Lydia led the way through a narrow hall lined with glass trinkets. Tiny birds, flowers, even a miniature fountain displayed on polished shelves. The air carried the faint scent of beeswax and lavender, a testament to Lydia's meticulous care. The drawing room was a cozy space, with chintz armchairs, a low oak table, with a tray of tea and scones, her hands trembling as she poured from a silver teapot. "Don't mind Victor, miss," she murmured. "He's upset, that's all. We all are." Her apron was spotless, but Miss Marple noted a faint smudge of soil on her sleeve, as if she'd been in the garden earlier. Arthur Grimshaw, Thorne's business partner, paced near the fireplace, his stern face framed by a bristling mustache. His suit, tailored and city-smart, marked him as an outsider in St. Mary Mead's pastoral setting. "A terrible loss," he said gruffly, pausing to accept a cup from Lydia. "Elias was the heart of the glassworks. Without him, I don't know how we'll manage." His voice held a note of calculation, and Miss Marple wondered if his concern was for the man or the business. The door opened, admitting Eliza Croft, a local botanist who supplied Thorne with rare plants for his garden inspirations. In her early 40s, she was an elegant woman with auburn hair pinned neatly under a wide-brimmed hat, her green dress accentuating her poised demeanor. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Elias and I worked closely together. He turned my flowers into eternal glass. Such a gift." Her eyes lingered on the garden, a flicker of sorrow passing over her face. Last to arrive was Harold Digby, the gardener, a burly man in his 60s with hands calloused from years of toil. His tweed cap was clutched tightly in one hand, and his weathered face bore a scowl. "Didn't expect to be back here so soon," he muttered, refusing tea. "Mr. Thorne sacked me yesterday. Over a broken pot, if you can believe it. Said I was careless. Me, who tended this garden like my own." His voice was rough with resentment, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward Victor, as if blaming him for some unspoken slight. Tea was served, and the conversation turned to Thorne's life and work. Lydia, hovering with the tray, spoke fondly of her employer. "He was a kind man, miss. Gave me a glass bluebird for my birthday last year." But delicately. Elias was protective of his art, but he trusted me with his plans. We'd spend hours in the greenhouse discussing which blooms would inspire his next piece. He seemed distracted recently, though. Kept muttering about betrayal. Her voice was calm, but Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in her hand as she set down her cup. Digby, standing awkwardly by the door, interjected. "He was distracted, all right. Caught him staring at that rose bush last week, like it held all the secrets of the world. Then he turns around and fires me for a cracked pot. I've half a mind to—" He stopped, catching himself, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up his neck. As the conversation ebbed, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the garden visible through the window. The greenhouse, a glass and iron structure tucked behind a row of hollyhocks, caught her eye. It was where Thorne grew his rare plants, some supplied by Eliza, and where he often experimented with his glass designs. Excusing herself, she stepped outside, ostensibly to admire the flowers, but her true purpose was to observe. The greenhouse door was ajar, and she slipped inside, the air warm and heavy with the scent of earth and greenery. Inside, rows of plants lined wooden benches, exotic orchids, vibrant foxgloves, and a cluster of nightshade with its deadly berries. Miss Marple's knowledge of gardening, honed over decades, told her that foxglove could be distilled into digitalis, a heart stimulant in small doses, a poison in larger ones. Her eye scanned the shelves, landing on a small glass vial tucked behind a pot, its rim faintly stained with a greenish residue. It smelled faintly bitter, not unlike the plants around it. A clue, perhaps, or a gardener's oversight. As she examined the vial, she noticed a faint stain on the workbench, a sticky smear, like sap from a plant. It reminded her of something she'd seen earlier, a similar mark on Victor's cuff during tea, barely noticeable but distinct in the sunlight. Sap from a poisonous plant, perhaps? Or was it mere coincidence, a red herring planted by circumstance? Dig secrets, and that stray glass petal still troubled her. It was like a stitch dropped in a knitting pattern, small, but enough to unravel the whole, if pulled. In St. Mary Mead, she knew shadows cast by glass could be as dangerous as those cast by men. Chapter 4. Tangled Vines of Deceit. The sun dipped lower over St. Mary Mead, painting the sky with hues of apricot and lavender as the village settled into the quiet hum of late afternoon. The initial flurry of gossip surrounding Elias Thorne's death had deepened into a persistent undercurrent of suspicion, with villagers casting sidelong glances at one another and whispering over teacups about what might lie beneath the surface of the glassmaker's demise. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped snugly against the cooling air, walked purposefully toward the glassworks on the outskirts of the village. Her morning at Glassbloom House had introduced her to the key players in this unfolding drama, and now she sought to deepen her understanding of Elias Thorne's world. The glassworks, where his artistry met commerce, promised insights into the tensions that might have led to his untimely end. Her steps were measured, her walking stick a mere prop, for her mind was as agile as ever, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle like stitches in a complex lace pattern. The glassworks was a modest stone building, its chimney puffing faint wisps of smoke from the furnaces within. The air carried the sharp tang of molten glass and charcoal, a contrast to the floral sweetness of Thorne's garden. As Miss Marple approached, she noted the sign above the door, Thorne and Grimshaw Glassworks, its letters faded but proud. The surrounding yard was cluttered with crates of raw materials and discarded glass fragments, glinting like forgotten jewels in the grass. She paused to admire a discarded piece, a flawed glass orchid that caught the light in a way that mimicked life itself. It was a reminder of Thorne's genius, and perhaps, she thought, of the passions that genius could ignite. Inside the workshop was a hive of controlled chaos. Furnaces glowed with faint-hearted. He led her through the workshop, pointing out the tools and processes with a mix of pride and impatience. Elias was the artist. I'll give him that. I handled the books, the contracts, the deals. We were set to sign with a big London firm for his new iridescent blooms. Worth a fortune, those were. Miss Marple paused by Thorne's workbench, a cluttered space marked by the chaos of creation. Among the tools lay a blowpipe, its tip dusted with an odd powdery residue, not the usual ash or glass dust, but something finer, almost like pollen. She bent closer, her spectacles catching the light. "How curious," she murmured. "Is this typical, Mr. Grimshaw? This powder?" Grimshaw frowned, peering at it. "Not really. Probably residue from one of Elias's experiments. He was always mixing new compounds for his colors. Iridescent glass needs special chemicals, you know." His explanation was plausible, but Miss Marple noted the quickness of his response, as if he'd anticipated the question. She made a mental note to inquire about the powder's composition later. Perhaps Dr. Haydock could shed light on it. As they continued the tour, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects she'd met. Victor Thorne's financial troubles and argument with his uncle pointed to greed. But was it too obvious? Lydia Hawthorne's nervousness and unpaid debts suggested fear of exposure, yet her devotion seemed genuine. Eliza Croft's collaboration with Thorne hinted at a deeper bond, possibly tinged with rivalry, and Harold Digby's dismissal over a broken pot masked a deeper grudge, perhaps. The glassworks, she sensed, was a nexus of their motives, where art and ambition collided. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, a young but capable officer from the county police who had learned to value Miss Marple's insights. His neat suit and earnest demeanor stood out in the smoky workshop. "Miss Marple, a pleasure to see you," he said, tipping his hat. "I was just coming to speak with Mr. Grimshaw. We're still treating Thorne's death as natural, but I'd like to cover all bases." Of the workshop, where a stack of papers caught her eye. Most were sketches of glass designs, roses, lilies, intricate fountains. But one scrap, half buried under a mold, was different. It was a fragment of a letter. The handwriting hurried. "Know what you've done. Pay up or I'll tell." The rest was torn away, but the tone suggested blackmail. Whose hand had written it? Grimshaw's? Or was it a plant meant to mislead? Before she could examine it further, Grimshaw returned, his expression guarded. "Find something interesting, Miss Marple?" "Merely admiring the artistry," she replied smoothly, tucking the observation away. The letter fragment was a clue, but its authenticity was uncertain. Perhaps a red herring designed to cast suspicion. She thanked Grimshaw and Craddock, promising to share any further thoughts, and stepped back into the cooling evening air. As she walked toward the village, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lydia Hawthorne's nervous demeanor. A false lead had emerged earlier that day. Mrs. Price Ridley had mentioned Lydia's unpaid debts to Thorne, hinting she feared dismissal. Curious, Miss Marple detoured to the village shop, where the grocer, Mr. Jenkins, confirmed Lydia's alibi for the morning of the death. "She was here, buying flour and sugar, just after 8, he said, showing a receipt time-stamped 8:15 a.m. Seemed in a hurry, but nothing unusual. The alibi was solid, yet Miss Marple wondered why Lydia had been so flustered if her errands were routine. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The click-clack was a soothing counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The glassworks had revealed more than tools and sketches. It had shown her the stakes of Thorne's world. His iridescent technique was a prize worth stealing, or killing for. The powdery residue on the blowpipe could be innocent, but paired with Craddock's mention of a substance in Thorne's system, it suggested a darker possibility. And the letter fragment? Blackmail was a powerful motive, but it could also be a distraction. Like there. Plants, like glass, could be beautiful and deadly. St. Mary Mead, for all its charm, was no stranger to such contradictions. Miss Marple's needles paused as she gazed out the window, the garden's shadows blending with her thoughts. The truth, she knew, was like one of Thorne's glass blooms, fragile, intricate, and waiting to be uncovered by a careful hand. Chapter 5. Fractured Alliances. The village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with the cheerful chaos of its annual spring fete, held on the green under a sky streaked with wispy clouds. Brightly colored stalls lined the lawn, offering homemade jams, knitted tea cozies, and games of hoopla, while children darted about, clutching sticky buns and laughing as a brass band played a jaunty tune. The air was rich with the scents of freshly cut grass, warm scones, and the faint tang of lemonade. Yet, beneath the festive surface, the shadow of Elias Thorne's death lingered, casting a pall over the chatter and fueling whispered speculations among the villagers. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a neat tweed skirt and her best Sunday hat adorned with a single rose, strolled among the stalls, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The fete, she knew, was a perfect stage for human nature to reveal itself. Tempers flared, secrets slipped, and alliances like glass could crack under pressure. Miss Marple paused at a stall selling lavender sachets, her fingers brushing the soft muslin as she listened to the hum of conversation around her. The villagers were abuzz with theories about Thorne's demise, their voices a blend of sympathy and suspicion. "Heart attack, they say," muttered Mrs. Jenkins from the grocer's, arranging jars of chutney. "But I saw him last week, strong as an ox tending those glass flowers. Something's not right." Nearby, a group of young mothers nodded, their eyes darting toward Glassbloom House, visible beyond the green, its garden a silent witness to tragedy. As Miss Marple moved toward the tea tent, her attention was drawn to a heated exchange near the tombola stall. Victor Thorne, accusation suggested a deeper rift, perhaps tied to the inheritance Mrs. Price Ridley had mentioned. Eliza's composure, meanwhile, seemed a touch too practiced, as if she were guarding a secret. The fete, with its public stage, was unraveling tensions that might otherwise have remained hidden. Miss Marple made a mental note to probe further, her mind recalling a similar scene years ago, when a village quarrel over a prize marrow had revealed a motive for theft. She continued her circuit, pausing to admire a display of glass trinkets, some of Thorne's simpler creations, donated to raise funds for the church roof. The pieces sparkled in the sunlight, their delicate forms a testament to his skill. Among them was a small glass rose, its petals etched with faint veins, not unlike the unbroken petals she'd found in the garden. The similarity was striking, and she wondered if it held a clue, or was merely a coincidence, another thread in the tapestry of misdirection. As she sipped tea in the tent, served by a flustered Lydia Hawthorne, Miss Marple overheard another snippet of gossip. "I saw Harold Digby poking about the garden this morning," whispered Miss Weatherby to a friend, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. "Looked like he was tampering with the tools by the shed. Suspicious, if you ask me, after Mr. Thorne sacked him." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Digby, the dismissed gardener, had been vocal about his grudge, but tampering with tools? It could be a red herring, designed to cast suspicion, or a sign of something more sinister. Seeking clarification, Miss Marple approached the tool shed later, when the fete's crowds had thinned. The shed, tucked behind a row of hollyhocks near Glassbloom House, was a weathered structure filled with spades, rakes, and pruning shears. Digby was there, retrieving a spade with a scowl. "What are you doing here, Miss Marple?" he growled, his calloused hands tightening on the handle. "Just getting my tools. Thorne can't stop me now, can he?" "Merely enjoying the fete, Mr. Digby. Something curious myself. A stain, like sap, on Mr. Digby's gloves. It reminds me of one I noticed on Victor Thorne's cuff, and another in the greenhouse. Perhaps it's from one of Miss Croft's plants." She kept her tone light, but Craddock's eyes sharpened, and he jotted a note. As the fete wound down, Miss Marple lingered near the churchyard, where a group of children played among the gravestones. Her thoughts turned to a discovery she'd made earlier that day while passing the compost heap near Glassbloom House. There, half buried among wilted leaves, was a torn letter fragment, its handwriting sharp and angular. "You'll regret crossing me. The truth will out." The rest was missing, but the tone suggested a threat, possibly blackmail. The script resembled Arthur Grimshaw's from invoices she'd seen at the glassworks, but it could be forged, a clever misdirection to implicate him. She resolved to compare it with other samples, perhaps Lydia's or Victor's, to test its authenticity. The fête's music faded, and villagers began drifting home, their baskets heavy with raffle prizes and homemade goods. Miss Marple, however, felt the day's events had tightened the web of suspicion. Victor's public spat with Eliza hinted at a will altered by influence or manipulation. Digby's presence at the shed suggested lingering resentment, or perhaps a search for evidence to clear his name. The sap stains, linking Victor, Digby, and the greenhouse, were a recurring motif, like a refrain in a song. But whether they pointed to poison or mere gardening was unclear. And the letter fragment, with its ominous tone, could be a key or a trap. Sitting on a bench by the green, Miss Marple reflected on a case from her youth when a village seamstress had been blackmailed over a secret affair, her guilt betrayed by a nervous stitch in her embroidery. The parallels were striking: hidden motives, public facades, and the quiet malice that could fester in a small community. She thought of the glass petal again, its deliberate placement in the garden a silent accusation. Was it a killer's oversight, or a calculated move to mislead? The spring fete had left behind a trail of scattered bun wrappers and fading laughter. But for Miss Jane Marple, it had also unveiled a web of fractured alliances and tantalizing clues. The confrontation between Victor Thorne and Eliza Croft, the sap-stained gloves in Digby's shed, and the ominous letter fragment in the compost heap had tightened the threads of the mystery surrounding Elias Thorne's death. Now, as stars began to prick the sky, Miss Marple sat in her cozy cottage, her knitting needles idle for once, her sharp mind sifting through the day's observations. The glassmaker's garden, with its interplay of real and artificial blooms, seemed a fitting metaphor for the case. Truth and deception intertwined, reflecting each other like mirrors in a maze. The morning brought a renewed sense of purpose. Miss Marple, dressed in a sensible wool skirt and cardigan, her straw hat exchanged for a practical scarf against the early chill, made her way back to Glassbloom House. Inspector Craddock had arranged to question the suspects formally, and he'd invited her to observe, knowing her knack for spotting what others missed. The drawing room, with its chintz armchairs and view of the fateful garden, was less welcoming in the gray light of dawn. The fire in the grate had died to embers, and the air held a faint dampness, as if the house itself mourned its master. Inspector Craddock stood by the bay window, his notebook open, his young face serious but approachable. "Miss Marple, your insights have been invaluable," he said quietly as she entered. "The post-mortem's in. Dr. Haydock confirmed digitalis in Thorne's system, enough to stop his heart. It's not conclusive proof of murder, but it's suspicious. Digitalis can come from foxglove, which we know grows in the greenhouse. I'm hoping today's interviews will shed light." Miss Marple nodded, her blue eyes gleaming with interest. Foxglove, indeed. Such a beautiful plant, yet so dangerous in the wrong hands. Let us see what our friends reveal. She settled into an armchair, her hands folded neatly. Her demeanor as unassuming as a village spinster, but her mind as sharp as a fresh... Next came Arthur Grimshaw, his mustache bristling as he sat stiffly. "I was at the glassworks as always," he said brusquely. "Up at 6, checking inventory. The apprentice can vouch for me, though I sent him on an errand around 8. Craddock pressed for details, but Grimshaw's answers were clipped, his eyes darting to the garden where the shattered rose bush stood. Miss Marple recalled the letter fragment with its threatening tone, its handwriting so like his. Was it genuine, or a clever forgery to cast suspicion? Lydia Hawthorne entered next, her apron crisp, but her face pale, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "I was at the shop, Inspector, buying supplies. Mr. Jenkins has the receipt. 8:15 it was. I'd never harm Mr. Thorne. He was like family." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple's heart softened. But she noted the muddy shoes from yesterday. Lydia claimed she'd been weeding, but the greenhouse's damp earth could tell a different story. Eliza Croft followed, her elegance undimmed despite the somber occasion. "I was botanizing in the meadows," she said, her voice steady. "I often walk alone to study wildflowers. No one saw me, I'm afraid, but that's my habit." Her composure was flawless, but Miss Marple detected a slight hesitation when asked about her greenhouse visits. Eliza's expertise with plants, especially foxglove, made her a figure of interest. Finally, Harold Digby shuffled in, his gardener's cap crumpled in his hands. "I was home sulking," he admitted gruffly. "After Thorne sacked me, I didn't feel like facing the world. My wife can confirm I never left the cottage." His scowl deepened, but Miss Marple recalled his presence at the shed during the fete. The sap-stained gloves a silent accusation. Could he have slipped into the garden earlier? As the interviews concluded, Craddock shared a new finding. "The lab results on that powder from the glassworks are back. It's not a glass-making compound, but a plant-based residue, possibly digitalis extract. We're testing the greenhouse vial next." Miss Marple's mind raced. The vial she'd found, with its bitter scent, could be. Plants stood tall, their purple bells deceptively innocent. The vial was gone, likely taken by Craddock's men, but the workbench still held that sticky sap stain, matching those on Victor's cuff and Digby's gloves. Miss Marple's knowledge of village life told her such stains were common among gardeners, but their recurrence across suspects was no coincidence. She recalled a case from her youth where a poisoned chalice had been hidden in plain sight, its contents betrayed by a careless smudge. The parallels were uncanny. As she left the greenhouse, she spotted a villager, old Mr. Pym, tending his hedge nearby. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called. "Heard there was a shadowy figure by the garden the night before Thorne died. My dog was barking fit to wake the dead." Miss Marple smiled politely, suspecting another red herring. The postman's late rounds had already been mistaken for skullduggery, but she made a note to confirm Mr. Pym's story. In St. Mary Mead, shadows often proved more revealing than light. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple poured a cup of tea and resumed her knitting, the click of her needles a rhythm to her thoughts. The alibis were flimsy: Victor's solitary walk, Grimshaw's lone inventory, Eliza's meadow ramble, Digby's sulking, even Lydia's shopping trip left gaps. The digitalis in Thorne's system pointed to poison, likely from the greenhouse, but who had the knowledge and opportunity? Eliza's botanical expertise was obvious, but Victor's cunning, Grimshaw's ambition, Digby's grudge, and Lydia's access could not be dismissed. The letter fragment nagged at her. Its threat of exposure suggested blackmail, but its resemblance to Grimshaw's handwriting could be a plant, perhaps by Victor, to deflect suspicion, or by Eliza, to protect her own secrets. The glass petal, too, was a puzzle. Its engraving hinted at intimacy, yet its placement screamed calculation. Was it a clue to the killer's identity, or a mirror reflecting a false image? As the village clock chimed, Miss Marple set down her needles. The case was a hall of mirrors, each clue letter fragment, and the digitalis in Thorne's system were like scattered beads, waiting to be strung into a coherent pattern. Today she resolved to tug at a few threads, trusting that human nature, like her lacework, would reveal its design under scrutiny. Her first task was to visit Eliza Croft, the botanist whose composure at the fete had cracked under Victor Thorne's accusations. Eliza lived in a modest cottage on the village's western edge, its garden a riot of experimental plants that rivaled Thorne's in beauty, if not in glass. Miss Marple knocked gently, her walking stick resting lightly against her side. Eliza answered promptly, her auburn hair pinned neatly, though her eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, her voice warm but guarded. "Please come in. Would you care for tea?" "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple replied, stepping into a parlor filled with botanical sketches and pressed flowers framed on the walls. The air smelled of lavender and earth, a contrast to the sterile heat of the glassworks. As Eliza poured tea from a delicate porcelain pot, Miss Marple steered the conversation gently. "I've been admiring your work with Mr. Thorne. His glass flowers were so lifelike, almost as if they grew from your plants. You must have been close collaborators." Eliza's smile was wistful. "We were, in a way. Elias had a gift for capturing nature's essence. I supplied the plants, rare orchids, foxgloves, even nightshade for study, and he turned them into art. He was generous with his praise." Her fingers tightened around her cup, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor. "Generous in other ways, perhaps?" Miss Marple ventured, her tone mild. "I heard he intended to leave his garden to you, for preservation. That must have meant a great deal." Eliza's eyes widened, then softened. "He mentioned it, yes. He wanted the garden to be a living museum, not sold off for profit. But it wasn't my idea, I swear it. Victor thought I was scheming, but Elias decided on his own." Her voice held a note of sincerity, yet Miss Marple sensed a guarded edge, as if Eliza were weighing her words. Greenhouse, its glass walls fogged with condensation, and examined the foxglove plants again. Their purple bells were untouched, but nearby a cluster of nightshade berries gleamed darkly. Nightshade, she knew, was deadly but less likely to mimic a heart attack than digitalis. The vial she'd seen before was gone, taken for analysis, but its bitter scent lingered in her memory. As she studied the workbench, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a new detail. A smudge of the same sticky sap she'd seen on Victor's cuff, Digby's gloves, and in the shed. It was faint but unmistakable, and it came from a rare plant in the corner, a datura, its trumpet-shaped flowers deceptively beautiful. Datura, she recalled, was toxic, though not the source of digitalis. Its presence suggested someone had been experimenting, perhaps masking one poison with another. The sap's recurrence across suspects was no coincidence, but was it evidence of guilt or a gardener's carelessness? Her musings were interrupted by a rustle outside. Peering through the greenhouse door, she saw Victor Thorne himself, pacing near the rosebush, his cigarette glowing in the morning light. He seemed agitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Miss Marple stepped out quietly, her approach soft but deliberate. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice gentle. "Revisiting the garden so early?" Victor started, dropping his cigarette. "Oh, Miss Marple. Just needed some air. This place feels like a tomb now." His eyes darted to the greenhouse, and Miss Marple caught a slip in his words. "That vial you found in there," he said almost too casually. "Probably just some plant food, right? Uncle was always mixing things." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. She hadn't mentioned the vial to anyone but Craddock. "Vial, Mr. Thorne?" "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, her tone innocent. Victor's face flushed and he stammered. "Oh, just something I heard. Village talk, you know." His slip was telling, a detail only someone familiar with the greenhouse's contents would know. As Victor hurried, alight with news. "The vial's contents are confirmed. Digitalis extract, pure and potent. It was hidden behind a pot, not exactly where you'd keep plant food. We're testing for fingerprints, but it's a start." He paused, then added, "And that letter fragment you mentioned? The handwriting's close to Grimshaw's, but it's not conclusive. Could be a forgery." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. The digitalis pointed to deliberate poisoning, and the vial's placement suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the greenhouse, Eliza, Victor, or perhaps Digby. The letter, with its blackmailing tone, could implicate Grimshaw, but its ambiguity hinted at misdirection. She shared her observation of Victor's slip, and Craddock's eyes narrowed. "He's hiding something, that's clear. I'll press him again." As Craddock left, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from the scarf taking shape. The case was crystallizing, like one of Thorne's glass blooms under heat. The engraved petal, with its mysterious E, suggested a personal motive, perhaps Eliza's, though her affection for Thorne seemed platonic. Victor's knowledge of the vial, paired with his financial desperation, made him a prime suspect. Yet his carelessness felt too obvious. Grimshaw's ambition, Digby's grudge, and Lydia's nerves remained in play, each a facet of the mystery's prism. She recalled a village scandal from years past, when a jealous suitor had sabotaged a rival's garden, leaving a single flower as a taunt. The parallels were striking. Pride, betrayal, and a carefully placed clue. The glass petal, the vial, the sap stains, all were gleams of truth amid the mirrors of misdirection. As the village clock chimed, Miss Marple set down her needles, her eyes bright with certainty. The truth was near, hidden in the everyday, waiting for her to polish it clear. Cracks in the facade. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting golden rays that danced across the village's thatched roofs and blooming hedgerows. Yet the air held up the glassworks, overseeing the evening shutdown of the furnaces, the air thick with the acrid scent of cooling glass. The workshop was quieter now, the apprentice gone home, leaving only the hum of dying embers. Grimshaw looked up as she entered, his mustache twitching with irritation. "Miss Marple, twice in 1 week? You're becoming a regular," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "I do apologize, Mr. Grimshaw," she replied, her voice as mild as a summer breeze. "But I find myself curious about Mr. Thorne's final days. You mentioned disputes over profits, quite heated ones, I gather." Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, watched his reaction closely. Grimshaw's jaw tightened, but he met her gaze. "Elias and I disagreed, yes. He was an artist, not a businessman. Wanted to keep his designs exclusive, while I saw the potential for mass production. That London contract could have made us rich, but he dragged his feet. Said someone was stealing his techniques. Paranoid nonsense, if you ask me." His words were firm, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he feared she'd seen the letter fragment resembling his handwriting. "Paranoia can stem from truth," she mused, her tone light. "That letter I found, such a threatening tone. It looked rather like your script, Mr. Grimshaw. Curious, don't you think? She let the question hang, observing as his face paled slightly. Letter? I don't know what you mean, he said quickly, turning to adjust a tool on the workbench. Plenty of people scribble notes around here. Could be anyone's. His deflection was too swift, and Miss Marple filed it away, suspecting the letter was either his or a clever forgery to implicate him. Leaving the glassworks, she reflected on Grimshaw's ambition. The London contract was a powerful motive, but his alibi, alone at the glassworks, was shaky. She needed more to pin him down. Her thoughts turned to Harold Digby, the gardener whose grudge seemed deeper than a mere dismissal. She found him at the village pub, the Blue Boar, nursing a pint in a corner. Said gently, "Did he have proof?" Her question was probing, but her tone disarmed, as if she were merely curious. Digby shrugged, his scowl softening. Nothing but his suspicions. Found a glass leaf in my shed once, claimed it was his. I told him it was a gift from years back, but he wouldn't listen. His story was plausible, but Miss Marple recalled the sap-stained gloves in the shed. Could Digby have been in the greenhouse tampering with more than tools? As she left the pub, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the greenhouse and its deadly contents. The digitalis confirmed in Thorne's system pointed to poison, likely administered in his morning tea, a ritual Lydia Hawthorne oversaw. She decided to visit Lydia next, catching her at Glassbloom House as she polished the silver in the kitchen. The housekeeper's hands trembled, and her eyes were red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. "Oh, Miss Marple," Lydia said, setting down a teapot. "It's been so hard, keeping the house in order with Mr. Thorne gone. I feel him watching, from that garden." Her voice quavered, and Miss Marple offered a sympathetic nod. "It must be difficult," she said. "I noticed your shoes were muddy the other day, Lydia. Been in the greenhouse, perhaps? Those foxgloves are lovely, but dangerous, aren't they?" Her question was gentle but pointed, and Lydia's hands froze. I was weeding, miss, that's all," she stammered. "The greenhouse soil gets everywhere. I'd never touched those plants. Mr. Thorne warned me about them." Her alibi matched her earlier claim, but the muddy shoes paired with her access to Thorne's tea raised questions. Miss Marple recalled the vial's placement, hidden yet accessible to someone familiar with the greenhouse. A crucial discovery came later that day when Inspector Craddock called at her cottage, his face alight with news. "We've got fingerprints on the vial, Miss Marple, Victor's, clear as day. And the lab confirmed the sap stains are from datura, not foxglove, but it's still toxic. Could be a cover to throw us off the digitalis trail." He paused, then added, "We also have access," and Eliza's botanical knowledge formed a web of motives, but the cracks were showing. The glass petals E engraving nagged at her. Perhaps a gift from Eliza, or a taunt to implicate her? The letter fragment, too, could be a forgery, designed to mislead. As evening settled, Miss Marple walked to the garden once more, drawn to the shattered rose bush. The shards were unchanged, but the soil beneath revealed a new clue. Faint footprints, small and narrow, matching Lydia's shoes from the tea party. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth, suggesting she'd been there after her claimed weeding. A slip or deliberate deception? Miss Marple's mind flashed to the tea ritual, Lydia's domain, where digitalis could easily be slipped into a cup. Back at her cottage, she poured a fresh cup of tea, the steam curling like her thoughts. The case was a delicate balance, like one of Thorne's glass sculptures. Victor's fingerprints and slip made him the obvious suspect, but the datura and footprints pointed elsewhere. Grimshaw's denial of the letter, Digby's accusations of theft, and Eliza's guarded sincerity added layers of doubt. Miss Marple knew that in St. Mary Mead the truth often hid in the cracks. Small, overlooked, but ready to shatter the facade when pressed. Chapter 9. Shards of Revelation. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead, shrouding the village in a silvery veil that softened the outlines of its cottages and gardens. The weight of Elias Thorne's death pressed heavier now, as whispers of poison and betrayal wove through the community like ivy. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender scarf knotted neatly and her eyes bright with purpose, stepped out of her cottage, her walking stick tapping a determined rhythm. The clues had multiplied. Victor's fingerprints on the digitalis vial, the datura sap stains, the threatening letter fragment, the engraved glass petal, and Lydia's muddy shoes. Each was a shard in a broken mosaic, and Miss Marple, he'd received an anonymous note. Something about paying for his secrets. She thought it was nonsense, but it shook her badly. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. An anonymous note? It echoed the letter fragment she'd found, suggesting a deeper scheme. Blackmail, perhaps, or a trap to unsettle Thorne. Thanking the vicar, she made her way to Glassbloom House, where Inspector Craddock had agreed to meet her for a final sweep of the garden. The air was damp, the roses glistening with mist, and the shattered rose bush stood as a stark reminder of the crime. Craddock greeted her with a nod, his notebook bulging with notes. "Miss Marple, we've got new evidence. The vial's fingerprints are definitely Victor's, and we found a trace of digitalis in a teacup from Thorne's breakfast tray, Lydia's domain. But the letter fragment's print is still inconclusive. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A teacup is telling, Inspector. Lydia's access to it is undeniable, but Victor's fingerprints suggest he handled the poison. The datura stains, though, those are curious. They link Victor and Digby, but not Lydia. Perhaps we're meant to look one way while the truth lies elsewhere." She paused, her gaze settling on the glass petal, still lying apart from the wreckage, its E engraving catching the light. "That petal," she mused, "is too deliberate. A signature or a misdirection?" Craddock nodded, following her lead to the greenhouse. The glass walls were streaked with condensation, the air heavy with the scent of earth and blooms. The foxglove plant stood undisturbed, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the datura, its trumpet-shaped flowers deceptively serene. She examined the workbench where the sap stain remained and noticed something new. A tiny glass vial, not the one she'd found before, tucked beneath a pot. Its rim was clean, but a faint residue inside smelled bitter. Digitalis again? Or something similar? She pointed it out to Craddock, who bagged it carefully. "Another vial," he said, frowning. "Someone's been careless, or wants us to think so." As they left the greenhouse, Miss Marple spotted Lydia in the garden, pruning Mrs. Hawthorne. Lydia shook her head, claiming it was lost, but her eyes flicked toward the compost heap where Miss Marple had found the fragment. Another crack in the facade, Miss Marple thought, but not enough to convict. Determined to test Victor's story, Miss Marple and Craddock visited him at the Blue Boar, where he was staying. He was in the lounge, nursing a whiskey, his charm replaced by a sullen edge. "What now, Inspector?" he asked, barely glancing at Miss Marple. "I've told you I was by the river that morning. Yet your fingerprints were on a vial of digitalis, Craddock said sharply. And you knew about it before we mentioned it. Care to explain? Victor's face flushed, his hands gripping the glass. I was in the greenhouse, all right, helping Uncle with his plants days before. Must have touched something. I'm no poisoner. His denial was vehement, but Miss Marple caught a lie in his eyes. The river path was a weak alibi, and his knowledge of the vial was damning. Yet the datura stains on his cuff suggested a deliberate attempt to confuse. Perhaps someone else's hand at work. Next, they sought Eliza Croft, who was tending her garden. Her composure was intact, but her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she clipped herbs. Miss Croft, Miss Marple said gently. That glass petal in the garden, with its E, it's exquisite. Did you and Mr. Thorne exchange such gifts? Eliza hesitated, then nodded. He made it for me, years ago, as a thank you for my plants. I never thought. It's just a coincidence, surely. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple sensed a guarded truth. The petal could implicate her, yet its placement felt staged, as if meant to mislead. Finally, they visited Harold Digby at his cottage, where he was repairing a rake. His scowl deepened at their approach. Still hounding me, eh? He muttered. I told you I was home when Thorne died. Craddock mentioned the sap-stained gloves, and Digby's eyes flashed. I work with Inspector. It reminds me of a village play years ago, when a prop knife was swapped for a real one, nearly causing tragedy. Someone's staging this scene, but they've left a flaw. She thought of the petal's E, the anonymous note, the footprints. The truth was close, shimmering like one of Thorne's glass blooms. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the village quiet save for the distant hoot of an owl. The shards of revelation were aligning, but the final piece eluded her. In St. Mary Mead, where every garden held a story, the truth would shine through the cracks, if only she could find the right angle. Chapter 10. The Bloom of Justice. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, its light filtering through the budding leaves and casting intricate shadows across the village green. The air was alive with the scent of blooming lilacs and the distant chatter of villagers, yet a hush seemed to settle over Glassbloom House, as if it knew the mystery of Elias Thorne's death was reaching its denouement. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders, and her eyes alight with quiet certainty, stood in the garden where it all began. The shattered glass rosebush, with its scattered shards and that single, enigmatic petal engraved with an E, stood as a silent witness to the truth she was about to unveil. Today, with Inspector Craddock's help, she would gather the suspects and piece together the final shards of the puzzle, revealing the killer in a village where secrets bloomed as readily as flowers. Miss Marple had arranged for everyone to meet in the drawing room of Glassbloom House, a setting both familiar and charged with the weight of recent events. The room, with its chintz armchairs and view of the garden, felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of cautious anticipation. "Miss Marple," he said quietly as she entered, "I trust you've worked your magic. The evidence is strong, but it's into a deadly design." Her eyes swept the room, noting each reaction: Victor's fidgeting, Grimshaw's stiffness, Lydia's trembling, Eliza's stillness, Digby's clenched fists. She turned to Victor first. "Mr. Thorne, your fingerprints were on the vial of digitalis, and your slip about it revealed you'd been in the greenhouse. Your debts and argument with your uncle over the will gave you motive. The sap stains on your cuff, datura, not foxglove, suggested a clever attempt to mislead us. Yet your carelessness was too obvious, almost staged. Why?" Victor's face flushed, his cigarette trembling. "I told you I was helping Uncle with plans. I didn't poison him. Yes, I needed money, but I'd never—" His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted his desperation. Genuine, but not entirely innocent. She shifted to Grimshaw. "Mr. Grimshaw, your ambition for the London contract clashed with Elias's artistry. The letter fragment, with its threatening tone, resembled your handwriting, suggesting blackmail. But it was too convenient, wasn't it? A forgery, perhaps, to cast suspicion." Grimshaw's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, his silence more telling than words. To Lydia, she said, "Mrs. Hawthorne, your muddy shoes and access to the tea tray made you a suspect. The digitalis in the teacup was your domain, and your nervousness hinted at guilt. Yet your devotion to Elias was real. Why then the fear?" Lydia's eyes filled with tears, her hands clutching her apron. "I was scared, miss. That note. I thought it was meant for me, too." Eliza was next. "Miss Croft, your botanical expertise and closeness to Elias raised questions. The glass petal with its E, a gift, you said, but its placement in the garden was deliberate, a taunt or a trap. Did you know more than you let on?" Eliza's composure wavered, her hands twisting. "I loved his work, nothing more. The petal was a coincidence." Finally, Digby. "Mr. Digby, your dismissal Grimshaw's, but Eliza's. You confronted her, and she confessed to blackmailing Elias, threatening to reveal his secret, a formula for his iridescent glass, which she'd sold to a rival for profit." Lydia gasped, her face crumpling. I didn't want to believe it, miss. She said she'd ruin me, too, if I spoke. I kept quiet, but I didn't poison him." Eliza's face drained of color, her elegance shattered. Miss Marple continued, her eyes on Eliza. "Miss Croft, you betrayed Elias's trust, selling his designs to fund your botanical experiments. When he grew suspicious, you poisoned his tea with digitalis, knowing it would mimic a heart attack. You smashed the rosebush to stage a collapse, but you left the petal. A taunt, or a mistake. The datura was your cover, implicating Victor and Digby, and the forged letter pointed to Grimshaw. But the petal's E was your signature. A flourish of pride." Eliza stood, her voice trembling. "You can't prove it. It's all conjecture." But Craddock stepped forward, producing the second vial from the greenhouse. "This has your prints, Miss Croft, and traces of digitalis. We also found your notebook hidden in your garden, detailing the formula you sold. It's enough for a warrant." The room was silent, save for Lydia's soft sobs. Victor exhaled, relief mingling with guilt. Grimshaw's shoulders relaxed. Digby's scowl faded. Eliza's composure broke, her hands covering her face as Craddock led her away. As the suspects dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the garden, the glass petal glinting in her hand. She recalled a village betrayal years ago, when a trusted friend had sabotaged a rival's roses, undone by a single misplaced seed. The parallels were clear: greed, pride, and a fatal flaw. The truth, like Thorne's glass, was fragile but undeniable when held to the light. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles